Turin, March 1963. Alberto Ascari Jr. sat in a cafe reading the morning paper. Page 6. Sports section. Small column on the right. Ferrari announces new lead driver for Monaco. His name was in the headline. He read it 3 times before he believed it. No one from Ferrari had called him. No meeting. No letter. No handshake. He learned he'd been promoted the same way a stranger on the street would, from a newspaper. Alberto Ascari Jr. carried a heavy name. His father, Alberto Ascari Sr., had been one of Ferrari's greatest drivers, 2-time world champion. Dead at 36, killed testing a sports car at Monza in 1955. Enzo Ferrari had attended the funeral but said nothing to the family. That was 8 years before this moment. Junior joined Ferrari in 1961 as a reserve driver. Not because of his name. Ferrari hated nepotism, but because he was fast, disciplined, quiet in the garage, aggressive on the track. For 2 years he waited. Test sessions, practice laps, occasional substitute drives when lead drivers were injured. He never complained, never pushed for more. He understood Ferrari's system. You earned your seat through patience and performance, not demands. But by early 1963, the mechanics were talking. The lead driver, Marco Santini, was fast but reckless. 3 crashes in 4 months. The car was expensive to rebuild. Ferrari's budget was tight. Everyone in the factory knew a change was coming. Everyone except Ascari. The call should have come a week earlier. Ferrari's secretary always contacted drivers directly when assignments changed. A formal phone call. Time and date for a meeting. Professional courtesy. But Ascari's phone never rang. He sat in the cafe for 20 minutes. The waiter asked if he wanted more coffee. Ascari didn't hear him. He was trying to understand if this was an honor or an insult, and whether Enzo Ferrari even knew his name had been published. Ferrari's secretary, Maria Costanza, had worked at the factory for 12 years. She knew the protocol. She had made the call to every driver who'd been promoted since 1951. But 3 days before the newspaper announcement, Ferrari walked into her office and placed a folder on her desk. "Monaco lineup," he said. "Send it to the press office." She opened it, saw Ascari's name listed as lead driver. "Should I call him first?" she asked. Ferrari was already walking away. "No need," he said. She waited for him to explain. He didn't. Maria stared at the folder for a long time. In 12 years, this had never happened. Drivers were always told first. Always. It was a matter of respect, of preparation. She considered calling Ascari anyway. Ferrari wouldn't know. But she had learned something in 12 years. When Ferrari gave an instruction that felt wrong, there was usually a reason, even if no one else understood it. She sent the folder to the press office. The next morning, La Gazzetta dello Sport ran the story. Ascari arrived at the factory at 6 a.m., the day after reading the paper. He didn't know if he should be there. Didn't know if the newspaper had printed a mistake. Didn't know if Ferrari knew. The mechanics saw him first. Tommaso, the head mechanic, was adjusting the suspension on the Monaco car. He looked up, saw Ascari, and nodded. "Seat's been adjusted for you," Tommaso said. "Your measurements." Ascari stopped walking. When? 2 weeks ago. So Ferrari had known, had planned this, had adjusted the car for Ascari's body before anyone, including Ascari, knew he'd be driving it, but hadn't told him. Ascari stood outside Ferrari's office for 5 minutes. He raised his hand to knock, lowered it, raised it again. Finally he turned and walked back to the garage. He didn't knock, because he realized something. If Ferrari had wanted to tell him, he would have. The silence wasn't an oversight. It was the message. The mechanics debated it for days. Why hadn't Ferrari told Ascari? Tommaso thought it was a test. He wants to see if the kid will crack under pressure, show up confused or show up ready. Another mechanic disagreed. It's about the father. Ferrari doesn't want to make it personal. A third shook his head. Ferrari doesn't care about feelings. He cares about results. Maybe he thinks telling drivers makes them soft. None of them were right, but none of them were completely wrong. What no one in the factory knew, what perhaps even Ferrari didn't fully acknowledge, was that Alberto Ascari Sr.'s death had broken something in Ferrari. Not visibly. Ferrari didn't grieve in public, didn't speak about it. But those closest to him noticed small changes after 1955. He stopped attending drivers' funerals, sent flowers, never went. He stopped visiting drivers in the hospital after crashes, sent assistants. He stopped learning drivers' personal details, wives' names, children's ages. He built a wall between himself and the men who drove his cars. And now, 8 years later, the son of the driver whose death had initiated that wall was sitting in the car his father once drove. The psychological weight was impossible to articulate, so Ferrari didn't. He just adjusted the seat and sent the announcement to the press. Ascari spent 3 days preparing. He didn't ask Ferrari for a meeting, didn't seek clarification, didn't demand acknowledgement. He studied the Monaco circuit maps, reviewed telemetry from the previous year's race, talked to Tommaso about brake balance and tire degradation. He acted as if he'd been formally appointed, because in Ferrari's logic he had been. The newspaper was the appointment letter. The other drivers noticed. Marco Santini, the man being replaced, arrived at the factory on the 4th day. He'd been in Milan, hadn't seen the announcement. He walked to his usual car, the Monaco car, and found Ascari adjusting the mirrors. "What are you doing?" Santini asked. "Preparing," Ascari said. "For what?" Ascari looked at him for a long moment. "You haven't read the paper?" Santini's face went white. Santini did what Ascari hadn't. He knocked on Ferrari's door, didn't wait for an answer, walked in. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Those outside heard Santini's voice rise, heard Ferrari's voice stay level. Then silence. Santini walked out, face pale, packed his things from the garage, left the factory. No one saw him again that season. Tommaso asked Ferrari later, carefully, if Santini had been told about the change before the announcement. Ferrari looked at him. He knew his performance was inadequate. "But did you tell him he was being replaced?" "I told the press." Tommaso didn't ask again. What Tommaso didn't know, what no one knew, was that Ferrari had written 2 letters the night before the announcement went to press. One to Ascari, one to Santini. Both sat on his desk, sealed, addressed. At midnight, Ferrari burned them both. Ferrari sat at his desk and watched the paper curl into ash. The letter to Ascari had been brief. "You will drive Monaco. Seat is prepared. Perform as expected." The letter to Santini had been even shorter. "Your contract will not be renewed for Monaco. Performance insufficient." Both letters were true. Both were clear. Both were professional. But as Ferrari looked at them, ready to be sent, he realized something. The letters assumed communication was necessary. But what if it wasn't? Ascari would see the announcement. He would understand. He would prepare. Santini would see it. He would understand. He would leave. The outcome would be identical. But without the letters, something else would happen. Both drivers would have to decide how to respond without Ferrari guiding them. Ascari could panic, could demand explanation, could feel insulted and quit, or he could accept it as the appointment it was, and prepare. Santini could rage, could fight, could demand a meeting, or he could accept the end and leave with dignity. Ferrari was testing something deeper than driving skill. He was testing character under ambiguity. And ambiguity, he believed, revealed more truth than clarity ever could. He burned the letters, sent the announcement to press, and waited to see who his drivers really were. What he didn't expect was that one of them would understand exactly what he'd done, and thank him for it. Monaco, May 26, 1963. Ascari qualified 4th, not spectacular, but clean, no mistakes, consistent lap times. Ferrari watched from the pit wall, said nothing. Race start. Ascari held position through the first 10 laps, moved to 3rd by lap 20, 2nd by lap 40. Lap 52, the leader's engine failed. Ascari inherited 1st place. He held it for the remaining 28 laps, not through bravery, not through risk, through precision. Every corner exact, every braking point calculated. No wasted motion. He drove like someone who'd been preparing in silence for years. When he crossed the line, the radio crackled. It was Tommaso, the mechanic, not Ferrari. Ferrari didn't use the radio during races. Never had. On the podium, Ascari looked for Ferrari, found him standing at the back of the pit area, arms crossed, watching. Their eyes met. Ferrari nodded once, then turned and walked back to the garage. 20 minutes later, after the press interviews, Ascari found Ferrari in the garage. Ferrari was running his hand along the car's front wing, checking for damage. Ascari stood beside him, didn't speak. After a long silence, Ferrari said, "The car performed adequately." "Yes," Ascari said. Another silence. Then Ascari said something that surprised everyone who heard it. "Thank you for not calling." Ferrari's hand stopped moving on the wing. He looked at Ascari. "You understood," Ferrari said. "Not a question." "I understood," Ascari confirmed. What Ascari understood was this: if Ferrari had called him, it would have been a gift, a favor, something given. But by not calling, Ferrari had made it a fact, a reality, something earned. The newspaper announcement wasn't coldness, it was respect. Ferrari was saying, "You don't need my permission. You don't need my encouragement. You are the driver. Act like it." And in that cafe in Turin, when Ascari read his name in the paper, he'd had a choice. He could have felt disrespected, could have called Ferrari angry, could have demanded an explanation. But instead, he'd chosen to see it as Ferrari saw it. The announcement wasn't the beginning of his promotion. It was the confirmation of something already true. He was already the driver. He just hadn't known it yet. Ferrari nodded slowly. "Your father," he said, "would have understood the same way." It was the first time Ferrari had mentioned Ascari Sr. in 8 years. Ascari didn't respond. Didn't need to. Ferrari walked toward his office, stopped at the door, turned back. "Monaco was adequate," he said. "The next race will need to be better." Ascari smiled. "It will be." Ferrari's expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened. "Good." The door closed. Tommaso approached after Ferrari left. "Did he say congratulations?" Tommaso asked. "No," Ascari said. "Did he explain why he didn't call you?" "No." "Then what did he say?" Ascari looked at the car. "He said the next race needs to be better." Tommaso laughed. "That's Ferrari congratulating you." "I know," Ascari said. The mechanics who'd been at Ferrari longest understood something the newer ones didn't. Ferrari's silences were a language. You either learned to speak it, or you didn't last. Ascari had learned. Not through instruction, not through explanation, through observation, through patience, through accepting that some men communicate through absence rather than presence. In the weeks after Monaco, something subtle changed in the garage. Ferrari began appearing more often during Ascari's practice sessions. Not to speak, just to watch. Once, after a particularly clean qualifying lap, Ferrari walked past Ascari and said, simply, "Again." Ascari went out and did it again, faster. Ferrari nodded and walked away. That was their relationship. Minimal words, maximum understanding. Other drivers found it frustrating. They wanted feedback, wanted praise or criticism, wanted to know where they stood. But Ascari understood that Ferrari's presence was the feedback. If Ferrari was watching, you mattered. If Ferrari said again, you were on the right path. If Ferrari said nothing at all, you were exactly where you needed to be. The 1963 season continued. Ascari won 2 more races, finished on the podium 7 times, ended the championship in 3rd place. Ferrari never called him into the office for a formal review, never sat him down to discuss performance, never explained the strategy behind his silence. But at the end of the season, Ascari's contract for 1964 arrived in the mail. No phone call, no meeting, just the contract. Ascari signed it and sent it back. He didn't need a conversation. He understood. Years later, in 1971, a young journalist interviewed Ascari about his time at Ferrari. "What was it like working for Enzo Ferrari?" the journalist asked. Ascari thought for a long time. "He treated you like you were already what you needed to become," Ascari finally said. "He didn't guide you there. He didn't hold your hand. He just acted as if you'd already arrived, and you had no choice but to prove him right." "Did that feel cold?" the journalist asked. "Sometimes," Ascari admitted. "But it also felt like the greatest compliment I ever received." "How so?" "Because it meant he believed you were strong enough not to need comfort, capable enough not to need explanation, professional enough not to need praise." "Did you ever wish he'd been warmer?" Ascari smiled. "Once or twice, but then I realized, warmth is easy. Anyone can be warm. What Ferrari gave was harder. He gave you the space to prove who you were without him telling you first. And the newspaper announcement. When you found out you'd been promoted by reading it in the press? Best moment of my career," Ascari said. "Why?" "Because he didn't give me the promotion. He just announced what was already true. I was the driver. I just hadn't realized it yet. The newspaper didn't make it real. It made me realize it had been real all along." The journalist didn't understand. But Ferrari would have. In 1988, the year Ferrari died, Ascari attended the funeral. He hadn't seen Ferrari in person for over a decade. Their paths had diverged. Ascari retired from racing in 1969, became a driving instructor, lived quietly in Turin. But when he heard Ferrari had died, he took the train to Modena. The funeral was massive. Thousands attended. Politicians, drivers, engineers, celebrities, everyone who'd been touched by Ferrari's empire. Ascari stood at the back. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, Maria Costanza, Ferrari's former secretary, now in her 70s, approached him. "Alberto," she said, "I'm glad you came." "Of course," Ascari said. "I wanted to tell you something," Maria said. "About the announcement." Ascari looked at her. "Ferrari wrote you a letter," she said. "The night before the press release. He wrote one to you and one to Santini." "I never received a letter," Ascari said. "I know. He burned them. Both of them. I found the ashes in his wastebasket the next morning." Ascari was quiet for a long moment. "What did the letter say?" he asked. "I don't know. They were sealed. But I always wondered if you knew, if he'd told you later." "He never told me," Ascari said.
Does that bother you? That he wrote it but never sent it? Ascari looked across the cemetery, at Ferrari's grave, at the flowers, at the legacy of a man who built an empire on steel and silence. No, Ascari said finally, it doesn't bother me. Why not? Because burning the letter was the letter. He was telling me I didn't need his words. I needed to trust myself. And he was right. Maria nodded slowly. He respected you, she said, in his way. I know, Ascari said. I always knew. They stood together in silence for a while. Then Ascari said something Maria would remember for the rest of her life. The greatest gift Ferrari ever gave me wasn't the car, wasn't the wins, wasn't even the championship points. It was teaching me that I didn't need him to tell me I was good enough, that if I was waiting for someone else to validate me, I'd already lost. Did you ever tell him that? Maria asked. Once, after Monaco. I thanked him for not calling. What did he say? He said I understood. That was all. Just you understood. Maria smiled. That was his way of saying he was proud. I know, Ascari said. He stayed at the grave for a few more minutes, then left. He never visited Modena again. But every year, on the anniversary of that 1963 Monaco race, Ascari would take out the newspaper clipping, the one from La Gazzetta dello Sport. Ferrari announces new lead driver for Monaco. He'd kept it, framed it, not because it was the moment he became a lead driver, but because it was the moment he realized he already was one. And Ferrari, in his silence, had known it before anyone else. The clipping hung in Ascari's home office until he died in 2003. In his will, he left it to the Museo Ferrari in Modena. It's there now, in a small display case, easy to miss among the trophies and cars and photographs of legendary victories. Just a yellowed newspaper clipping, a small column, a simple announcement. But to those who understand Ferrari's language, the language of silence, of respect through absence, of trust expressed through withholding, it's one of the most profound artifacts in the entire museum, because it represents something Ferrari believed deeply but rarely articulated, that the greatest leaders don't create followers, they create other leaders, and they do it not by telling people who they are, but by treating them as if they already are, even when those people don't know it yet, especially then. Have you ever been given responsibility without explanation? Have you ever had someone believe in you before you believed in yourself?